It's thinking about it. Looks like we're live, kids. So, David from Wyoming Whiskey.
Yes,
I have
sir.
been looking forward to talking to you for 2 weeks. I'm very excited about it. I even went out to Wang's Liquors right here in Amesbury, Massachusetts, picked up a little Wyoming whiskey. Thank you, Jeff, for helping me out. Guys, I'm super excited to be doing this. Liam, thank you very much for arranging it. Jeff from Ale House, Barking Dog, Blue Moon, Morning Buzz, Craig McPherson representing Crave, Paul Eastman from Phat Cats, and Scott Whitley, Wicked Bites TV. We're talking to a genius here. I'm super
Well, why don't I get the little bottles and you have the big ones, Sean?
Well, this size matters, Mr. Whitley. Carol tells you that all the time. David,
Yes, sir.
Welcome aboard. Please give us a little rundown on how amazing you are.
Well, I'm pretty amazing today. It's been a great winter for us. I'm a skier, and originally that's why I moved to Wyoming, was to take advantage of what I consider to be the greatest ski hill in the United States. And we had a February that was phenomenal. I think it was the fourth most snowfall in any one month in the history of the ski area. We didn't see the sun for like 23 days. It just kept snowing and snowing and snowing, and it was phenomenal. And then March 1 hit, and it's been sunny. And so now we've been out on the rivers doing a little fishing. So all's good.
I love it. I love it. So how did Wyoming Whiskey get started? I understand you made a career choice.
I did. It was a slight career, like an off-ramp of sorts. I'm a lawyer. I'm from the Northeast. I actually went to St. Lawrence University for undergrad. I went to Catholic University for law school. And I moved out here right after college, but then during the summers during law school. And then finally I ended up here in the fall of '96. And I had the fortune of meeting Brad and Kate Mead. And the Mead family is, well, they're very Kennedy-like when it comes to Wyoming. Obviously, we're a much younger state and not nearly as much history, but the Hanson family, which then kind of melded into the Mead family, very rooted here. Brad is a fourth-generation cattle rancher. His grandfather was a 2-term U.S. senator and governor of the state. And due to the very unfortunate circumstance of Brad's mother passing away earlier that summer, they were up to their eyeballs in work, both at the cattle ranch and in their law firm. So I walked in one day. Kate and I put it together that she and I had both gone to St. Lawrence, and they needed help, and I just seemed to fit in. So I got my first job here in Jackson at a great little law firm. And years later, I went out on my own. And the beginning of Wyoming Whiskey happened in June of '06, where Brad called me and in this very gruff voice said, "David, get over to our office. Kate and I have a proposal for you." So I walked over and, "What's going on?" And Kate walks in behind me, and it's this old house for here. And I got to remember who I'm talking to. Early 1900s wooden house, creaky. And I had this immense Catholic guilt my entire life. So I'm thinking, what did I do now? Did I fish where I wasn't supposed to fish? What did I do? And Brad said, Kate and I have decided we want to make bourbon. And it broke the tension, and I laughed right in his face, and he didn't laugh. And I looked at Kate, and she didn't laugh. And I was like, "So you're serious?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, how the hell do you make bourbon?" He goes, "That's for you to figure out." And there we go.
I love it.
So I had no history in the industry. I drank a lot of Jack and Cokes at St. Lawrence, and that's about the extent of it, with the exception of my dad introducing me to Elijah Craig right after college and said, "No, this is to be sipped, not shot. And I think I'm going to try to, develop you, my son." And that was kind of like the beginning of my whiskey tutelage.
So how'd you come up with the flavor profile of all your whiskeys?
So the first thing we did after this came up, my head, as you can imagine if any of you were approached with something you'd never, ever worked on or thought of in your life. Your head just spins. So I immediately started looking into it. There was no craft spirits industry. So you go to Mecca. So you go to bourbon country, and there's a Kentucky Bourbon Festival. So due to some connections that we had here in Jackson, we were able to sit down with Max Shapira of Heaven Hill, and he was very generous with his time. And he told us, don't do it. You are going to spend 3 times as much money. It's going to take you 3 times as long, and it's going to be 3 times as frustrating as you can imagine. So Brad and I left that office emboldened, thinking, oh, this guy thinks we're a threat. You know, we're going to absolutely, we're doubling down, we're doing it. And he was dead right. I'll just put it that way. I could have put it by a multiplier of 4. But while we were down there, we were able to meet up with a gentleman by the name of Lincoln Henry, Woodford Reserve. A true Kentucky gentleman, was very generous in getting us started. He introduced us to Rob Sherman and his family at Vendome Copper and Brass. And once we got our still ordered, I said to Rob, hey, man, we need a distiller, because I'm not going to run the still. No one's going to drink it if I make it. You know, we need to find someone who knows what they're doing. And about a month later, he found Steve Nally. And this is a long way to answer your question. Steve Nally comes from Maker's Mark. And so Brad and I had always really looked to Maker's Mark as being our go-to everyday bourbon when we were exchanging bottles for like birthdays and barbecues and whatnot. And so it was really kind of ideal that we found a guy that was making a wheated bourbon forever at Maker's Mark. And we were able to lure him and his wife Donna out to Wyoming to get us started. And so we had a bunch of different yeasts that we were using, but the mash bill is 68% corn, 20% wheat, 12% barley, all the grains grown here in Wyoming. We wanted that softer wheated bourbon profile, and which is a major component of the flavor profile. But the yeast really is what makes the profound difference, in my opinion. And we use 2 different yeasts. One's a real high yield yeast, and the other one is actually a white wine vintner's yeast, which is very uncommon in the industry.
Why that choice, the white wine yeast?
So Steve needed a still in order to experiment on. So I was able to find to the north of here, there's a little town called Kelly, Wyoming, and his dad had an old moonshiner still in his yard. So we were able to unearth this thing, literally. I mean, it was disgusting when we pulled it out, but we got it fixed up. It was copper, and we had 8 different yeasts. Lincoln had suggested the use of this white wine vintner's yeast, but it was particularly expensive. It was in liquid form. A lot of this yeast comes in brick form. And so we started out just using a high yield yeast, but we weren't happy with the flavor profile of the barrels. So Steve went back and said, I really think we should try this. And so we used a back set method, so we didn't have to pitch it with every fermentation. It worked, but now we're pitching it with every fermentation because we find that the yields are better. But it adds a sweetness and a fruitiness to our bourbon that we weren't getting out of the high yield yeast. And that's what we were looking for. We didn't want it to be a cumbersome bourbon. We didn't want it to be super light, but we wanted it on the light to medium body side, and the same with the flavors.
Well, super excited to taste it. And Liam, I wanted to tell you that when you brought me the samples, I still have not tasted it. So I will be tasting this absolutely fresh. David, when you talk about the cost of the yeast and repitching it for every batch, I know more about brewing beer than I do about distilling. Do you have to do a starter culture, get it going? How big does it got to get? And then what yield are you getting per batch of bourbon?
We're gunning for about 7 to 8% ABV coming out of each batch, out of each fermenter.
Yep.
Yes, we are pitching every time. We decided early on not to invest in doing our own yeast like lab, but you would be pitching it every time anyhow. But the cost involved in that was pretty high, and I would be willing to bet someday we will get there and we will do that. But at this point, we're pitching both yeasts together in the same fermentation, and they seem to play together pretty well. They do compete somewhat, but as you know, as a brewer, the bigger concern is making sure you're running a clean system, and that there's not any bacteria in there that stresses the yeast, which are 2 words that I never thought I'd use together. And once that happens, that's when you start getting some off-putting flavors and wrong alcohol components and whatnot.
Yeah, stressed yeast, off-putting flavors.
The worst.
So at Hoppy's Cantina, I'm new to the bourbon trail. So I've spent time talking to Jeff and to Paul and down at Crave and trying some things. Jeff and I recently tasted Elijah Craig, Buffalo Trace, and Whistle Pig.
And Eagle Rare, yeah.
Can you tell them which ones we had?
And that was an Eagle Rare was the other one.
Oh, yeah. The Reserve.
Yep.
And then Paul, last night I was down and Paul gave me some Blantons to taste. I really enjoyed that. I called it a control sample, but I don't know how controlled I was.
You got a little out of control.
It was fun. And then down at Crave, I got into the Jefferson's Ocean and 1784. So I'm coming around, and I discovered that I have, since my palate isn't very sweet, much like my disposition, I find that I'm really enjoying the rye whiskeys. But I understand your distiller has a particular rule about rye whiskeys. Is that true?
Indeed. Like I said, he was with Maker's Mark for 33 years, and they make one and only one type of bourbon, and that is a wheated bourbon. So you got to, look back at this point, 11, 12 years ago, when it was one of my many jobs was to kind of keep my finger on the pulse of what people were drinking. And, you read the trade periodicals and you try to, the tea leaves or, you're reading the tea leaves and all this. And there was a blip on the radar that showed that people were getting interested in rye again. And as you know, rye was really a frowned upon spirit for decades. It was swill. No one was making it. And so when I proposed to Steve that we make rye, he said, I don't want to make rye. I'm like, why is that? He goes, rye sucks. And I'm like, well, it doesn't really matter what you think or what I think, but the general public is starting to drink this, and we've got to plant grain, we've got to ferment, we've got to barrel, we've got to age. We're looking 6-7 years out before we have anything. He goes, I don't care. I'm not going to make it. And this guy technically is my employee, but you don't tell a guy who's in the Bourbon Hall of Fame, who's 6'5", by the way, and has mitts, the size of porterhouses, what to do. So I went to my partner, the ultimate boss, and made him do it. So I wore him out. He was convinced this is the right thing to do. So he called Steve up, and Steve was none too pleased by Brad telling him that he had to do this, but he did it. But day one, this was about a year later because we had to plant grain and do all that. Day one, he starts fermenting, and anybody who's ever worked with rye knows it's a difficult grain to work with. It becomes very foamy during the fermentation process, like a lot foamier than anything else you work with. So day one, I get this phone call from Steve, and I pick it up, and the first words out of his mouth, he was just like, I told you this was a bad idea. He's cursing the whole time. And I was like, what's going on? He goes, the ferments are overflowing. It smells like shit in here. And I was like, Steve, come on, man. You're in the Bourbon Hall of Fame. You got a Rolodex. You know everybody. I know you got this. Figure it out. So he did. He, I don't know who he got a hold of, but he talked to them, and there's certain processes that you can use to minimize it, but you're always going to have this foaming issue. So at the end of fermentation in November and December of 2011 is when he made all of it. He had made 100 barrels of rye whiskey and 200 barrels of bourbon made with rye. It was such brain damage trying to get him to do this that I never asked him again. The barrels were put up in the southwest corner of Warehouse A, where they sat for 3 years. And Steve, by that point, had gotten homesick. He'd been with us for about 8 years, and he was called home. So he and his wife moved back to Kentucky. We switched over to my partner's son as our new distiller. And the first thing I did when he went out to taste some of these barrels, and we brought in Nancy Fraley, who's an amazing talent and really a superhero. I asked them, let me know what this rye and that bourbon tastes like. So the first reports I got back were that it was some of the best young rye that Nancy had ever tried. I was shocked because I would have thought for sure this would have been terrible juice, that he would have intentionally made it bad, but he didn't. So I was pleasantly surprised. And I said, let's keep an eye on it. So year 4 comes around, and Nancy says, I think it's ready. And I said, well, we've learned our lesson about releasing bourbon too young. Let's give it one more year, and it'll give us an opportunity to come up with a name, marketing program, et cetera. So I called Sam, and I asked him, what's the mash bill of the rye? And he goes, you're not going to believe it, but it's only 48% rye. And those of you know that to be called a rye has to be at least 51% rye. So I said, do the math again, man. That's got to be wrong. He goes, I've done the math 6 times. You want me to tell you it's a rye? And I'm like, no, can't do that. So I panicked. I mean, I straight up panicked. And I called Brad, my partner and boss, and he said, well, what do we do? I don't know. I said, I have no idea what we do. Because now we have the very unsexy, wide category of straight American whiskey. And that people don't know what that is. You know, when you say bourbon, you know what bourbon is. When you say rye, you know what rye is. So the one upside of it is you've got a lot of latitude to work within that category. You know, it's not restrictive. So what Nancy and Sam and Brad and I came up with was, let's take a blend. We'll do a 2-to-1 blend. So we did 44 barrels of the bourbon made with rye with 22 barrels of the almost rye, as we were calling it. And that became our first season of this product. But we didn't have a name. I wanted to call it the Bastard Batch because it really seemed appropriate for what we were doing. But Kate put her foot down and said, over my dead body, are we putting a curse word on our label? Which at the time I was not very happy with, nor was anybody
now
with this name. But I'm glad we didn't do it now. So they challenged me to come up with something better and better, and I couldn't come up with anything. So I needed inspiration. So I called Steve. He's back in Kentucky, and I'm sure he had waited years for this phone call. So after the pleasantries were exchanged in the first few minutes, I brought up the rye, and I said, hey, man, I want you to know that rye you made is absolutely spectacular. And he's like, good, I'm really happy for you. You could, kind of feel this deep, proud voice, And I said, but man, we're having a hell of a time naming it. Why'd you only use 48% rye? He goes, because I told you I didn't want to make rye. And, my jaw dropped. You could have heard it bounce off the wooden desk. And I was like, he did it on purpose. So I called Brad and I told him, and he couldn't believe it. He goes, you're lying to me. And I said, I'm not at all. I said, I think we should call it Defiance. But there was a Defiant whiskey out there. And then Brad actually, who doesn't normally get involved in the creative side of this stuff, is the one who came up with Outrider. Like I said, he's a 4th generation cattle rancher. And the Outrider, spelled with an I, are the horsemen on the flanks that keep the calves and the stray cows from straying too far out into the prairie and whatnot. So it keeps them in. And we thought that was a fitting name for these barrels, which had seemed to have gone a little astray from what the original plan was.
That's awesome.
Great story.
Cool.
David,
in respect of your I'm sorry, somebody else.
What we should start with?
I would start with small batch.
Small batch.
Yep, running through the tasting, I would definitely start with small batch. It's our flagship product. It's 88 proof. It's going to be the most approachable, softest of all of the whiskeys that you have, of the 3 whiskeys you have in front of you.
You said 88 proof on this one?
What they're tasting, but I will tell you that the base flavor profile of all of our bourbons, at least, is caramel, orange, and vanilla. The COV flavor profile is what has come about. And you got to understand, some of this is by design, some of it is not. We picked the grains, we picked the yeasts, but then the maturation process is probably responsible for the majority of the flavor that you're tasting right now. And our bourbon matures in 53-gallon, full-size char 4 American oak barrels. And they're in steel buildings, concrete floors, but they're in the middle of a sage field with other rangeland grasses. And that is going to have a much bigger effect, or much different effect on the flavor of the whiskey than whiskeys that are sitting in the midst of bluegrass fields and, a bunch of deciduous trees in Kentucky. And so I know that environment plays a major role in why our bourbon tastes different and is set apart from the whiskeys you're going to taste from Kentucky.
Hey, David, question. When you do your tastings, you recommend ice or no ice?
I think every bourbon or whiskey should be tried neat first. First step.
Drink it right out of the bottle, Sean.
The first sip is always the the one you just have to get past that and kind of adapt your palate. Take a second, third sip, and then I like to add water or an ice cube to bring it down. Steve once told me that he thinks the best proof for tasting whiskey is about 65 to 70 proof. So putting in enough ice to melt down to that proof or water to bring it there would be like step 2 or 3 in your tasting process.
Okay.
And in my opinion, a lot of times people say, that ice or water will open up the whiskey. I never really understood early on what that meant, but now I have a much better understanding of it. And that is the alcohol is a strong, like it mutes your senses. It really burns your senses. You bring that alcohol down to a level where it's not burning your senses and allow your palate to pick up the flavors that are being muted. That's why it's, quote, opens up. So that lower proof is going to allow it, all those lesser or more subtle flavors to really shine.
Yeah, it's delicious.
Thank you.
Well done.
I like the coating on the mouth. It allows the flavor, the woodiness, the grassiness to sort of stay with the palate after you swallowed, which I think is nice because I don't like it when a whiskey just goes away. You know what I mean? I like to know that I'm drinking something real. Jeff.
Yeah. And I agree about, taking the sip of it straight first, because you do get to taste more of the flavors. As soon as you put it on the ice, it does break it down pretty quick.
Yep.
So I did it the opposite way. I did it on ice first, and then I tried it the other way. And I like it neat.
And a lot of people do. Everybody, I don't tell people how to drink it or what they're tasting. Some people love barrel strength stuff, 110, 120 proof bourbons. And not for me, like that wouldn't be where I go first, but more power to them. That it's all about the person who's drinking it. It's up to them.
David, this is the Outrider that we're having first. Where's that, without talking about actual dollar amounts, where does it fit price-wise in the other two that we're going to taste, the small batch and the double cask?
I thought this was the small batch. Weren't we doing the small batch first?
Small batch. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're small batch first.
Oh, I'm on the Outrider.
That's all right.
I screwed it up early.
That sounds like Sean.
Sean, why don't you
Maybe we'll
close
go
out your
next.
browser and come back again? All right, try that. It worked well the first time.
Sure.
Hey, Sean, your wife is a school teacher. She's going to dock you a few points on that.
Well, actually, she's been doing this Zoom remote learning. So when I got home, I had 8 minutes to set up. So I'm like, honey, where do I go? She's like, I've been doing this for a year. I'm like, yep. So I took her advice.
I just hope we're not zooming into one of her classrooms right now.
Yeah, that would be hilarious. I got to watch how, well, never mind. I'll leave that alone.
So, David, alcohol content same on these three, or they're all a little bit different?
88 proof on the small batch.
Mhm.
Reason being is Steve I'd asked Steve early on. I said, where do you think we should land on proof? And he said somewhere between 85 and 90 seemed right for what we were doing. And I said, how about 88? He goes, I like it. And I just picked that out of nowhere. Well, not out of nowhere. I graduated high school in 88, but I like the symmetry of it and whatnot. And it just made sense. So then when I started looking into the TTB requirements for our labels, you have to put the ABV. There you go. You got the right one.
Yeah.
You got to put the ABV on there. That's truly the requirement. Half of 88 is 44. Wyoming happens to be the 44th state admitted to the union. So it all really started coming together. We did a bunch on the bottle to try to make this look like it has history. The embossed Wyoming in the glass. If you look on the bottom of the bottle, let me see if I could. The double T on the bottom of the bottle is the Mead Ranch cattle brand. And that's still in use today. It's the oldest cattle brand in Teton County, Wyoming.
Sean, twist it up so we can see the bottom of the bottle.
There you go.
Oh, there's the T. I see it now.
There's the double T.
Yep.
And branding is a fascinating subject in and of itself. But, we wanted to make sure that we were, paying some sort of respect to the Mead family And since our company didn't have any history, we wanted to make sure that we were tying in the mead and the Hansen past. So the double T on the bottom, the 44 proof made a lot of sense, or 44 ABV made a lot of sense to us because the 44 weight, and there are other little subtle nuances on the bottle that we added in. I won't bore you with, but that's the base. That's the flagship product. That's the baseline of everything. That's a $45 bottle of whiskey on most shelves, and would be the bottom of our family of whiskeys. Double Cask and Outrider are at about the same price point, are about the same price point as each other, in that $75, $80 range. But again, there's a big difference here. All of our small batch is 5 years old, at least. We made a big mistake early on, and I take 85% of the credit or demerit from it. We released too young. We released a product that was just over 3 years old. The pressures that we had from our state, Brad's brother was running for governor, and he said, the first 3 questions from every stop along the campaign path was, when's the whiskey going to be ready? He wasn't even involved in the company, but things like that were hitting us from all sides. And so we released it too early, and we paid the price here at home. Luckily, it was a limited range of destruction, and so we were able to contain it. We bought back a bunch of whiskey and replaced it with older whiskey. And we won most people back, but a first impression is tough to unravel, so that was tough. So 5 years is what we settled on as the base. And then all of our products are 5 and up. Outrider that you have in front of you is going to be almost 9 years old. And that product is, yeah, it's fantastic. Outrider is, we couldn't have designed that product, The story that I told is authentic. I mean, there's nothing made up about that. And we had to pivot and adjust and do what we had to do in order to, put out a product that was fantastic. And we're happy about it, but we never could have designed that. And that kind of adds to the allure of the product because it's kind of a once in a lifetime thing that came about through true serendipity. And all of the stuff that we've been putting into the bottle, it's a year older every year. So what you've got in front of you there is 8 years, 8 months. And again, it was all made in November and December of 2011. And that would have been released over the last 6 months.
So David, aging it those extra couple of years, what exactly is it doing for it? Is it giving just a more flavor of the barrel, or is it settling down the alcohol content? What makes the difference between 3 years and 9 years?
So I'll actually start you from day one. It goes into the barrel clear, right? Most people don't know that whiskey's clear when it goes into a barrel. The barrel adds all of the color. In the first year, you pick up primarily color, not a lot of flavor. It looks like whiskey, but I assure you it really doesn't taste very good at all. Year 2, you start to pick up the right flavor profile. It's still very young, though, or green would be the term in the industry. By year 3, you're onto something. You see where this is going. We got caught up in it and comparing that to day 1, and we were like, oh my God, this is amazing. No, it's amazing compared to clear spirit that came off the still, but it's not amazing compared to anything else on the competitive shelf. By year 4, we found it turned the corner and it started to pick up a good finish. It didn't have that green bite to it. It didn't have the immaturity that you find in a lot of new brands. So if we would have waited until year 4, we would have been fine. But by year 5, the balance comes, right? You've got a nose, you've got a palate, and then you've got a finish. And you never want in anything, in a cocktail, on a plate of food or whatever, for there to be one thing that just spikes on you. Like you don't want to have a steak and you're like, oh my God, the pepper is overwhelming everything else. Same thing with whiskey. You don't want to have a floral explosion on the nose and then it goes flat through the flavor. We found at 5 years, that's when everything started to kind of level out and it became very balanced. And that's a word that I use a lot when it comes to this and in cocktails. So we found that balance. We found a really, really refined finish that lingered for a while. And we're like, okay, we trust Nancy Fraley. I could talk to her about her for an hour if you guys wanted me to, but we really defer to her when it comes to, where we should be landing on some of these products. And 5 years was right for small batch at that flavor, at that price point. So we're very happy with that. But what happens at 6, 7, 8, 9? At that point, you're looking at a couple of things. Yes, you're going to get more oakiness to the flavor profile. Some people like that, some people don't. When it starts to get 10 years plus, you're going to get a lot of that. But the other thing that's happening is it's oxidizing. These barrels are slowly, as you know, the angel share, it's evaporating out. It's bringing in oxygen from the outside, and oxidation with whiskey is a good thing. It smooths out the product. And some of our barrels that are like aggressive leakers, which just happens, we have found the best bourbon that comes out of our warehouse comes from a leaky barrel. I wish we could capture that stuff that's leaking out, or we knew that barrel in the back corner is doing that.
Does that bring up the alcohol content?
It can. We were barreling at 110 in the beginning, and we found some of these barrels coming out as high as 126. But sometimes it won't be that way. It's not always consistently higher. Sometimes it was lower, and we can't figure out why. Bottom of the warehouse, top of the warehouse are two different animals as well. But at the end of the day, I think what you find is the older it gets, the oxidation helps a ton, and the product becomes much more smooth. Think Scotch. A really old Scotch is wicked smooth. That's what we're getting to in a barrel that's used the first time after 6, 7, 8 years versus a Scotch barrel that's been used before. You're waiting 12, 18, 20 years to gain that same level of maturity.
Wow.
So I think the oxidation plays the biggest role in it at that point because it is smoothing out the product.
David, I mentioned that I come from more of a Scotch background, and I favor Islay, single malts, very pungent seaweed, iodine, salty. And for my 30th birthday, I purchased a 20-year-old Ardbeg, and Ardbeg is considered one of the most pungent, if not the most pungent. I also purchased a 30-year-old Ardbeg at the same time. We opened the 20-year-old for a friend's birthday, and I immediately regretted spending $360 on the 30-year-old. And I was afraid to drink it because I didn't want to know that I had screwed up really, really, really bad. My birthday's in June. I saved it until Christmas, and when I tasted it, I couldn't believe the difference. And that's essentially what you just described, is the extra 10 years, mellowing it, smoothing it out, contributing a little bit of character. Pretty wild.
Mm-hmm. It's more subtle refinements the older it gets. You have these massive changes over the first 6 years, and then the change, if it's getting better, and then it kind of doesn't plateau, but the curve flattens at that point, and it just gets slightly better over time. Mm-hmm. I believe that after a certain point, unless you're a true master at your trade, it starts to decline, because I personally don't love the super oakiness and the tannins and whatnot that are coming in at that point. But that's just me.
Ask you about that. The aging, is it too much for a whiskey to age for too long?
It can be.
Mm-hmm.
There's certain products out there that you guys have all heard of, Pappies and whatnot, that are pushing it out there to 18, 21, 23 years, and they're getting a king's ransom for these products. Because if you think about it, a barrel is draining out over those 23 years, and there's not much left at the bottom of that barrel when the time comes. Wow. It's super oxidized, which is great. It's got a depth of character to it that you're not going to find in anything younger. But what is that character? And, when it comes to a Pappy's, they do a great job. It's a wheated bourbon, which I think is what you need to do when you're aging whiskeys that long, or bourbons. But not for me. I wouldn't spend that money on a Pappy's because it just doesn't fit my flavor profile.
Jeff and Paul and Craig, I have a question for the three of you, because I'm so new at this, and Hoppy's is just trying to kind of growing into our big boy pants. I don't know how to build my portfolio. And if I just say, hey, Liam, what am I going to do? Well, then I'm in a shit show. What are some of in tasting the small batch and the Outrider, what are some of the things that you're seeing in this that you guys like based on the experience that you've had with previous bourbon tastings? Jeff?
It's tough, because there are people have so many opinions on what's going on. in this world. It is really, that's a tough question to answer. I mean, for me, I can just see right now how the Outrider is just that's my level right there. It's smoother, it's nicer, it's something you're gonna sip on, as you said. Something like this, you just sit back and relax and enjoy. The finish is amazing. It makes me want to have more. So really, it's like anything else, like food or anything else. You got to find a clientele, you got to hit them, and then you got to figure out what they're looking for.
And the Outrider's at 100 proof. You asked earlier about proof points.
Right.
Outrider's 100. It's bottled in bond, which has its own set of federal regulations. And we were striving to set ourselves apart from, at this point in our development, all of a sudden there were these new brands that were coming online that were sourcing whiskey from Indiana or Kentucky, just buying bulk whiskey, and then they were marketing companies, basically. They came up with a label and a cool bottle. They put it out there. And Brad said, we're the dumbest SOBs in the world. We built our own distillery. We could have done this, but we never would have done that given the heritage of the Mead family. But, we wanted to set ourselves apart. And when you say it's bonded, that means it was made under one distiller in one distilling season. It has to be bottled at 100 proof, has to be under government supervision, all these things. So that's why it's bonded. I think it helped set us apart because there's definitely a bonded following out there. There are people that follow bonded whiskey, so that helps. But you're really getting into the folks that are getting into the details, digging into the details of whiskeys. And then double cask, which we'll move on to whenever you guys are ready, is also 100 proof. We've had some debate internally on whether or not we should keep this at 100 or we should drop it down. But for the time being, it'll stay at 100.
Before we move on to the double cask, keep in mind I do not follow directions very well, and I started with the wrong whiskey. So I started with the Outrider when I should have had the small batch. Now, when I said I really loved the mouthfeel and how it clung to the palate, do you guys now understand what I was saying?
Oh, yeah.
Even though I was on the wrong whiskey.
You're on the right one.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And I hate to say that there's one whiskey in our portfolio that is the best, because again, it's up to the person drinking the whiskey, and what they like. I do all sorts of tastings in person when we're allowed to do such things, and I look forward to doing it again. And I'll ask people, what's your favorite one? And it really spreads across the gamut. Some people love our small batch because it is so approachable. Some call it, quote, sessionable, which I've never heard with a whiskey. A lot of people like Outrider, though, because it is so unique. It might be the story that they like more than anything else, on top of how good the liquid is, the viscosity that you're talking about, that it really hangs in the mouth. That's a good part of it. But yeah, every one of our bourbons and whiskeys is slightly different. And the goal is to touch a different flavor profile out there. And hopefully we offer what people, what everybody likes. At least one, if you were to find one person, they're going to like one of our whiskeys.
On the Outrider, how long is that aged for?
8 years, 8 months is the one you have in your hand.
Okay. I still think it has a smooth. It does hold on a little bit more, but it's still very smooth.
Yeah. So how many years, David, do you think you get left of the Outrider?
You ask a good question, Paul. We were going to let it ride into the sunset in 2 years. We were just going to drain what we have, and that was it.
Nope.
Edrington, who we're partnered up with, I learned during the negotiation process when they invested in our company that they really thought that Outrider was the future of our business. So we started making more of it just over 3.5 years ago. But we're making a real rye, 51%, and we're using the same bourbon with rye. What we decided to do is to not end the program. We want Outrider to live on forever. So what we're doing right now, actually, is we have pulled in probably 120 or so barrels of the older stuff and the younger stuff. And what we're going to do is we are going to blend the younger rye with the older almost rye in a steel tank and then recask it until the fall. Same thing with the bourbon, the older bourbon with rye with the younger bourbon with rye, blend it, let it marry, put it back in the barrels, and then put it back in the warehouse and let it get, subjected to this intense summer heat out here. Come fall, we will then dump all of that together to make this season's Outrider. That disqualifies it from a bonded product because it's made during 2 different seasons. And so moving forward, if we're going to do that, we're going to have to take the bonded moniker off of the bottle until we get to 1 season that we're making it out of, if that ever happens again. Because it does bind you up, because you can't use barrels from different seasons, even though the flavor profiles from those different seasons might be what you're really looking for. So whether or not it returns to bonded or not remains to be seen.
Why the steel cask?
Once you dump it out of wood, you don't want it to be affected by anything. You don't want it to be flavored. You don't want to put it in anything that's going to change its flavor profile. So stainless steel tanks is what we use.
And is that bonded right on the label?
Yep. I don't have a bottle with me here, or else I'd show you. There you go.
It's on the actual right up here on the top of the bottle. It says bonded. You can't see it through the top of the label, but it's right there.
Hey, David, I got a question for you, a pandemic question. So, you know, the impact of pandemic to Paul, to Jeff, has been pretty obvious, right, in the restaurant business. Scott also, as you know, Scott was doing nightly podcasts for months. Scott,
I think 89 nights in a row.
Yeah, yeah. So, and that was all in support of the local restaurants here on the North Shore and so forth. In your business, besides the obvious, right, in terms of being able to sell to restaurants that now were closed down or had to change to takeout or so forth, but from a production standpoint, how did the pandemic impact you guys in your business and what you do?
Well, like everybody, we locked up as soon as the country shut down. We got on an emergency board call with Edrington, and the decision was made to shut it down for a bit. So we shut it down while we figured out what was going to happen. And then from a sales perspective, end of March, April, early May, sales plummeted, less than, I would say, down 60%. Wow. Then later in May, they announced that Yellowstone National Park was opening here locally. And then across the country, everything started shifting to e-commerce, and everything started shifting to takeout. And people weren't just buying a drink at a restaurant, they were buying a bottle at a liquor store. Mm-hmm. And so our sales shot through the roof. We had the best
that's awesome.
9 months that we could have ever asked for. We had the biggest December. December was our biggest month we've ever had. Wow. And it was insane. I never saw that coming here in Wyoming. Throughout the Edrington Empire, as I call it, we saw our sales jump tremendously in almost all markets. And we started producing again in early summer, brought everybody in. I mean, the PPP loan helped a lot, because we really didn't know what was going to happen with sales, which is why we froze up. And now we're going like a bat out of hell. We increased our fermentation last year by 150%, which was the pinch point for us. And so now we can go. We're going 6 days a week now. We could go 7 and make even more if we want. But we're, guns a-blazing at this point.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I that's one thing I don't think anybody expected when the restaurants closed down, just did takeout. Liquor stores are getting such runs on everything.
Yeah.
So it was a good time for you to go get new customer base. They get to try your product as well.
Yeah, and we're a very uniquely situated company in that our home base is Wyoming. We have 7 million people visit Wyoming every year between the summer and the winter months, summer being the hugely, the biggest time. And people are coming from all across the country to come here. And Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park, which I'm looking at, was looked at as a safe place. Oh, the COVID doesn't exist out in Jackson. Let's go visit Jackson and let's go camping or whatever. It crushed us. Because people were bringing COVID in from everywhere. And, a lot of these restaurants here were open, diminished capacities, takeouts, whatever. But everybody got hit with COVID. They had to shut down for weeks at a time because it would run through the kitchen or whatever. But a lot of people came here. A lot of people grabbed a bottle, brought it home to Boston, to New Jersey, or wherever. I call it the tumbleweed effect. You know, tumbleweeds spread seeds by blowing across the country and depositing the seeds everywhere. I think the same thing happens with visitors to Wyoming. They bring home a bottle or two, go in, you know, invite their buddies over to their man cave and be like, try this. And it really helped us. And we've seen in the last year a lot of this seeding taking place across the country. And I have to give credit to where it's deserved. Edrington has done a fantastic job of promoting us, getting us onto things like this right now. You know, so we're really being exposed to more people, you know, for a number of reasons.
Good job, Liam.
I think Suzanne just asked, are any of you carrying his product at the restaurants right now?
So that's part of how this all got going. I met Liam through Katie Soares, who's my Partita contact. And when I heard about David and the whiskey, we wanted to do this. And Paul and Jeff and Craig, Blue Moon, Crave, Alehouse, Barking Dog, all these places. We're talking about trying to establish perhaps a bourbon diamond, a way that we can, you know, work together. Rising tide raises all boats, and we'd rather connect the dots and learn from each other and contribute. So I think it's pretty much 100% certain Wyoming whiskey is going to hit Amesbury real soon. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know from doing the TV show, the craft cocktails over the last 5 or 6 years have really picked up. Yeah. And now we're starting to see a lot of these speakeasies that are coming back and making a whole new life for themselves. And they're using these craft cocktails. They're using these name brands, and they're highlighting them quite a bit.
We came up with a drink called the Bourbon Bog. So I can't wait to try the small batch in the Bourbon Bog. It's a mule came straight north from Kentucky. I think Buford was his name, and he mudded his way up to Cape Cod and frolicked around in the cranberry bogs, and then had a little tasty sip of lemonade. It's a beautiful thing. You know,
this double cask is delicious.
Oh, are you under the double cask?
Oh, yeah. Well,
yes, now.
if
All
everybody hasn't already, why don't we move on to the double cask?
All right.
I wasn't waiting.
I was with you.
I didn't wait either.
Don't have to threaten me with a good time.
So double cask was like an evolution for us.
Mm-hmm.
We had small batch, we had Outrider coming, we had single barrel at this point, which when Nancy goes through hundreds of barrels at a time when she visits here, you know, she finds the top 1% of all of our barrels, and that's our there's a cat, the famous cat. The single barrel, you know, really, really it's the best expression of what we do. It's the most natural expression of what we do because it's at 96 proof. That's something that I would definitely sample at the bottle proof first before you start watering it down with anything, because it's been selected for its excellence. And every single cask is different, but the quality is going to be there. So we had all these products, and then I asked Nancy, I said, all right, let's show off. You know, what can we do as far as secondary maturation that is going to really emphasize our base flavor profile and enhance it? And she came up with she said, let's use Pedro Jimenez sherry casks. It's going to have a level of sweetness and a complexity to it that the base flavor, you know, the COV flavor profile doesn't have. And let's put it at 100 proof, so it's super rich. I look at it as a great dessert bourbon. So after dinner, you put this over a rock, sip on that for a while, or it makes an absolutely kick-ass Manhattan. I would put a Manhattan made with this up against any bourbon or rye out there, and I bet you we will either win the competition or be in the top 3 every time. It's that rich, it's that flavorful. I mean, you guys are tasting it now.
It's got a huge chocolate nose to it. I'm getting like Paul. I'm thinking paired with the what was the you know, I love your carrot cake, but the what was the chocolate one that you guys did recently?
Oh, the Hangover is always on the menu, but the chocolate.
Was it the Baileys?
But Bailey's
That's the one. Oh yes.
had to recreate the name due to politically correctness, but it's the chocolate Bailey's cake,
Yeah.
and it's unbelievable.
This is fantastic.
David, if you ever get up to New England, whether you come to any of our restaurants or not, one thing you do have to try is Phat Cats carrot cake. It's a legendary thing for sure.
I want to know why. What makes it so special?
Well, it's got vegetables in it, so it's
It's healthy.
It's the best way to disguise them, right? In a cake.
I will come. If I'm invited, I will make it as soon as we're allowed to travel and should travel and whatnot.
Awesome.
I'm going to be going to Maine. There's a bistro up in Maine called Novio's Bistro that I luckily got to meet this guy, Bob Cutler, and he named the restaurant after his baseball coach. And they have a restaurant, which is a bistro. They've got a speakeasy. And I've gotten to know this guy. He bought a full barrel of whiskey from us. He's done virtual tastings like this that I've been on 3 times now. And these are the experiences that I probably would not have had but for the pandemic. So I will do a loop, I promise. My folks are still in Albany. I will do a loop up through Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, come down through Boston, spend an extended amount of time there, go to Fenway Park, which is where I've never been, and see the Yankees whip up on your Red Sox.
Well, I don't know about the last thing, but we'll certainly get you to Fenway.
All right.
Yeah, get ready for tiny seats. That's all.
Yeah, I can attest to that. Oh,
Yeah.
David, do it during the summer so you don't have to even think about skiing, for one thing. But get used to black flies and mosquitoes because there's going to be plenty of that. Jeff, Paul, Craig, I as David was talking about making a specific cocktail with the double cask, it got me thinking, and we'll connect offline about this, about how to promote this bourbon diamond. And there is a move in the town to be painting some crosswalks, so maybe we can get on that. But maybe it's as simple as we take these Wyoming whiskeys and figure out what kind of cocktail we want to make out of it, and then people just go to the 4 places, the Bourbon Diamond, and they taste that Wyoming whiskey cocktail and just vote, and it's for fun. Just a thought.
Little cocktail competition with the Wyoming whiskey. Why not, right?
Cocktail.
Give us a reason to get out.
Wyoming, why not?
So, Liam, are
Yes.
you a full sales rep?
Yes, I have the whole market for Massachusetts for restaurants, bars, hotels. So basically all the on-premise.
And what distributor does this come through?
Martinetti.
Okay.
Yep, Martinetti Company. So all that will be coming through them. If you ever have any questions, obviously you've met Dave now, but if it's anything quick and easy that I can help you with, I'm sure Sean can get you my information, and I'm always around. So I'm really happy we were able to get together and do this. To be honest, like you guys said, it's just nice to have some FaceTime with everybody and be able to enjoy some spirits. So
Thank you, Liam. When this came up, and I thought immediately, let's connect the dots, right? And Jeff and Paul and Craig and Sean Toomey and Scott and everybody who's into it. You drove up here specifically just to bring extra whiskey so everybody could taste it. So good job, buddy.
Well,
Thank you.
driving around is easy, you know. Thank you for doing the legwork and getting everybody here, to be honest. So we'll give you a round of applause for that one. I appreciate that one, Sean. But Dave, thank you so much for coming and giving honestly knowledge to all of us, because just so you guys know, that is all new knowledge to me too. I kind of tried to give Sean my Outrider story, but as you can see, Dave tells it much better than I do. So it was just great talking with you, listening to how incredible this brand is and where the incredible places it's going to go. That's for sure.
Well, I will extend an invitation to you all. If you and your families are ever out this way, I insist that you come through Jackson. I'm looking down on the town right now. I'm right here. I love meeting all the people, that I look forward to meeting all the people that I've met virtually. And so please let me know. You can get in touch. It's David at Wyoming Whiskey, or Liam can get you in touch with me. And assuming that all goes well and we open back up, I hope to get an invitation to your all's restaurants, and I will swing through and make a pig of myself.
Awesome.
Wow.
I love it. Maybe we'll put together a private event. I think that would be fun.
We'll do a little bar crawl.
All right.
When Dave's in town.
Okay.
All right.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you
I
very
could
much.
lead the bar crawl since I don't have a restaurant or a bar. I'll just
You're good at crawling.
yeah,
I was
I'm
about
very
to
good
say,
at
we'll
crawling.
lead the crawling.
Carol can drive. You'll be fine.
That's right. Someone could drive. That's fine. I just need a designated driver, but I'm willing to take one for the team.
I love it.
Hey,
All
hey,
right,
hey,
guys.
David, really quick. I know we're like right at the top of the hour, but I got one quick question because you talked about your brand on the bottom of the bottle, and you said you had some branding stories. So what I'd like to know is, what do we need to do to get my family ranch brand on the bottom of a special release bottle for Hoppies? This is the Double H brand out of Salinas, California.
We're gonna buy a barrel, Craig. We're gonna buy
I think you're gonna have to send us some barbecue.
you talked about branding irons, and I got one right here in my office, so I just had to.
You should see Craig's left cheek.
It's a whole nother story.
Well, I'm sure there are ways to get it onto a bottle or a barrel much cheaper than spending millions of dollars on building a whole new distillery.
Probably. Hey, listen, thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to see everybody. Nice to see you,
Thank
Jeff.
you. Good to see you.
Nice seeing
Thank you
everybody.
guys so much. Hopefully we can do it again soon.
Awesome,
Thanks,
guys.
gentlemen.
Thank you very much. This was a lot of fun starting the Bourbon Diamond. Looking forward to exploring maybe a tequila trail. So let's talk. All right, guys. Love you.
Absolutely. See you guys.